Hello, my dear friends, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. I'm Edward, your host. You may know me from Warm Pages. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. What's the weather like where you are tonight? And do you have a little evening ritual that helps you unwind? Share it with us. I truly enjoy reading your comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, settle in. Our story begins. Chapter 1. The Intruder in the Purple Hills. The mist came down on Lockdoob like a wet wool blanket, thick and clinging, smothering the scattered lights of the village and turning the world beyond into a damp grey mystery. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the door of his croft, his flaming red hair barely visible in the gloom, and contemplated the pleasures of a quiet evening. It was the sort of evening that demanded a man do absolutely nothing at all. He had fed his sheep, a modest flock that grazed on the hill behind his house. He had fed Lugs, his dog, a strange beast with a fringe of hair covering his eyes, and a talent for looking perpetually mournful. He had even fed Sonsi, the wild cat he had domesticated through patience and tinned salmon, who now regarded him with the sort of tolerant disdain only a cat can manage. Hamish stretched his lanky frame and smiled. No crime, no emergencies, no reason whatsoever to venture out into the clammy embrace of a Highland November evening. The village of Lockdoob, pronounced Lockdoo by those who knew better and mangled by tourists who did not, was enjoying one of its periodic spells of peace. He should have known it would not last, for the trouble arrived in a Range Rover, sleek and expensive, its paint job far too shiny for the narrow, sheep-scattered roads of Sutherland. Hamish watched it pass his cottage with the lazy interest of a man who has nothing better to do, noting the London plates and the too-clean exterior. A city fellow, then. They always came north with grand ideas and no sense. By evening the stranger had made himself known to the entire village, and Hamish had received 3 phone calls, 2 visits, and 1 very pointed suggestion from the Curry sisters that he might want to do something about the man in the pub who was upsetting everyone. Hamish sighed. Peace, it seemed, had been a temporary visitor. The Lockdoob pub was warm and crowded when Hamish pushed open the door, Lugs padding faithfully at his heels. The usual crowd had gathered. Archie McLean hunched over his pint, temporarily escaped from his formidable wife. The Curry twins, Nessie and Jessie, perched like matching budgies on their preferred stools, and various crofters and fishermen nursing their drinks and their grievances. At the centre of the commotion stood a man who could only be described as aggressively well dressed. He wore a barber jacket that had never seen actual use, corduroy trousers with knife-edge creases, and the sort of confident sneer that marked him as a Londoner who believed the Highlands existed for his personal improvement. Alistair Vane, Hamish learned within 30 seconds of entering, was a carbon offset consultant, whatever that meant. He had leased the surrounding heather moors, he had plans, big plans, and he was explaining those plans with the sort of loud enthusiasm that made hardened Highlanders reach for another whisky. Traditional grazing paths will have to be redirected, Vane was saying, his voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having been properly contradicted. The native scrub must be protected. I've already instructed my solicitor to prepare trespassing notices for any crofter who interferes with the restoration project. The silence that followed was the dangerous kind. Archie McLean's weathered face had turned an interesting shade of red. That path has been used for 200 years, he said quietly. Then it's high time for a change, wouldn't you say? Vane flashed a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Progress, my good man. We can't remain stuck in the past forever. Hamish leaned against the bar and ordered a small whisky, watching the scene unfold with the weary recognition of a man who has seen this drama before. City folk came to the Highlands with regularity, armed with money and ideas and a complete failure to understand that the land had its own rules, older and more enduring than any lease agreement. Mr. Vane, Hamish said mildly, his Highland accent soft and unthreatening. Perhaps we might discuss this in a less heated atmosphere. Vane turned, his eyes sweeping over Hamish with barely concealed contempt. And you are? Police Constable Macbeth, I'm the local Bobby. Ah, the village policeman. Vane's smile widened. How quaint. Well, constable, you can inform your neighbours that I have every legal right to do as I please with my leased land. If anyone objects, they can take it up with my solicitors in London. Before Hamish could respond, a gentle voice cut through the tension. Perhaps some tea would help? Mrs. Mary Sutherland had appeared as if summoned by the prospect of conflict. She was a sweet-faced woman in her early 50s, softly spoken, with the sort of kind eyes that made schoolchildren confide their troubles and adults feel vaguely guilty about their bad behaviour. She ran the village primary school in the local history society, and she moved through the pub now with the calm efficiency of a born peacemaker. "I'm sure Mr. Vane did not mean to cause such upset," she said gently, placing a restraining hand on Archie's arm. "And I'm equally sure the villagers understand that change can be difficult for everyone. Perhaps if we all take a moment to calm down." She looked at Vane with such gentle reproach that even he seemed momentarily chastened. "I'm simply trying to explain the realities," Vane said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "Of course you are," Mary said soothingly, "and I'm sure everyone appreciates your passion for the environment. Now, who would like some tea?" The crisis diffused, at least temporarily, and the crowd began to disperse, muttering darkly about Londoners and their solicitors. Hamish watched as Mary efficiently served tea, calmed ruffled feathers, and generally restored a semblance of peace to the proceedings. Vane left shortly after, driving off in his shiny Range Rover with a final declaration about carbon offsets, an ecological responsibility that left the remaining patrons staring into their drinks with expressions of profound Highland scepticism. "That man," observed Nessie Curry. "That man," echoed her sister Jessie. "Aye," said Hamish, and left it at that. The next morning Mary appeared at Hamish's door with a basket of fresh scones, still warm from the oven. "I thought you might need these, Constable," she said with her gentle smile. "It's a terrible cold morning, and you work so hard for the village." Hamish, who had been working hard at absolutely nothing, accepted the basket with genuine pleasure. The scones were excellent, buttery and light, and he shared one with Lugs while Sonsie looked on with feline disdain. It was, he reflected, a perfect Highland morning, quiet, peaceful, and entirely free of crime. He really should have known better. By dawn the next day, Alistair Vane would be dead, and Hamish's peaceful existence would be shattered by the sound of DCI Blair's bellowing voice and the grim realities of murder in the heather. But for now he had his scones, his animals, and the satisfaction of a job not done. Life in Lochdoub was exactly as it should be. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery at Dawn. The telephone shrilled through Hamish Macbeth's sleep at 5:30 in the morning, a sound so unwelcome that even Lugs raised his head from the end of the bed and whimpered in protest. Hamish groped for the receiver, his mind still foggy with dreams of fishing and sunshine, neither of which were likely to feature in a November morning in Sutherland. "Macbeth," he mumbled. "Constable." The voice belonged to Dougie MacLeod, one of the local shepherds, and it was shaking. "You'd better come quick. Up on the moor, past the old Sinclair Croft. There's a body." Sleep vanished. Hamish was on his feet, reaching for his uniform trousers. "Dead?" "Oh, aye, very dead. It's that London fellow, the one from the pub." Hamish felt his heart sink. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Touch nothing, Dougie." "And tell no one else until I arrive." Fat chance of that, he thought grimly as he dressed. In a village the size of Lochdoub, news travelled faster than light, and with considerably more embellishment. The moor was shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, the kind that pressed against the eyes and made the beam of Hamish's torch seem feeble and inadequate. He left the Land Rover at the end of the track and climbed the rest of the way on foot, his long legs making easy work of the steep, rocky terrain. Dougie was waiting beside the ruins of the old Sinclair Croft, a shepherd's crook in one hand and his own torch in the other. His face, illuminated from below, looked ghastly. "Over there," he said, pointing. "I nearly stepped on him in the dark." Alistair Vane lay sprawled across the heather like a broken doll, and his expensive Barber jacket soaked with dew and something darker. His head had been caved in with brutal efficiency, and beside him lay the murder weapon, a heavy antique cast-iron peat cutter, the sort that belonged in a museum or a heritage display. Hamish crouched beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. The wound was savage but precise. A single blow delivered with considerable force, no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds on the hands. Vane had been taken by surprise, or had known his killer well enough not to fear them. The peat cutter was distinctive. Hamish recognised it immediately as the one that had sat in the village library as part of a small display on traditional Highland tools. Someone had taken it, carried it up here in the dark, and used it to end Alistair Vane's life. Either someone who knew the moor well enough to navigate it without light. Hamish stood and played his torch across the surrounding area. The ground was rocky, offering few footprints, but the killer would have needed intimate knowledge of this place to reach it safely on a moonless night. One wrong step and they could have broken an ankle or worse. "Did you see anyone else?" Hamish asked Dougie. "Not a soul. I was coming up to check on the ewes. Thought I'd get an early start before the weather turned." Hamish nodded. "Right, you'll need to give a statement. But first, help me secure the scene." They had barely finished stringing up the police tape when Hamish heard the sound he had been dreading, the roar of a car engine being driven far too fast for the narrow roads, followed by the slam of car doors and the unmistakable bellow of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. "Where's the body? Where's that useless streak of Highland misery Macbeth?" Hamish winced. Blair's arrival was as inevitable as it was unwelcome. DCR. Blair heaved himself up the slope, puffing and wheezing, his fat face already red with exertion and whiskey fumes. Behind him came his long-suffering subordinates, Detective Inspector Jimmy Anderson, looking like he wished he were anywhere else, and Detective Sergeant Andy McNabb trying unsuccessfully to keep up with his superior's furious pace. "Macbeth!" Blair jabbed a thick finger at Hamish. "Don't you dare contaminate my crime scene with your country bumpkin nonsense. This is a proper investigation, not one of your cosy little village mysteries." "Sir," said Hamish mildly, "the scene is secured. The body has not been moved. I was just about to call Strathbane." "You were just about to muck it up, more like." Blair pushed past him and stared down at Vane's corpse. "Right. City fellow, was he? Probably killed by one of your local yokels. I'll have this wrapped up by tea time." Hamish said nothing. Experience had taught him that Blair's certainty was usually inversely proportional to his competence. Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a slight shrug, a gesture that said clearer than words, "What can you do?" Blair was already barking orders, demanding the forensics team, the pathologist, and a full list of every person Vane had spoken to since arriving in Lochdoub. His detective sergeant scribbled furiously in a notebook, trying to keep pace with the cascade of demands. Hamish stepped back and let the circus unfold. There was no point in fighting Blair when he was in full flow. Better to wait, watch, and work quietly around the edges. The sun was beginning to rise, turning the mist golden, and revealing the full beauty of the moor when a small figure appeared at the edge of the crime scene carrying a large thermos and a basket. Mrs. Mary Sutherland picked her way carefully across the heather, her face pale with shock. "I heard the terrible news," she said softly. "I thought the officers might need some hot coffee. It's such a cold morning." Blair, who had been about to shout at her to leave, found himself accepting a cup of steaming coffee instead. There was something about Mary's gentle demeanour that deflected even his considerable rudeness. "Very kind, I'm sure," he muttered. "Such a dreadful thing," Mary continued, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee for the other officers. "Poor Mr. Vane. I know he upset people, but no one deserves this." "You knew the victim?" Blair's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. "Only from the pub last night. I tried to calm things down when he was arguing with the locals." She reached into her basket and produced a folded piece of paper. "I took the liberty of writing down everyone he spoke to, everyone he threatened with those trespassing notices. I thought it might help." Blair snatched the list and scanned it with satisfaction. Excellent. A proper witness with a proper statement, not like some I could mention. He glared at Hamish. Mary's list was comprehensive. Every crofter Vane had insulted, every local he had threatened. All neatly written in her schoolteacher's hand. It was, Hamish thought, almost too helpful. "Did you see Mr. Vane after he left the pub?" Hamish asked. Mary turned her kind eyes on him. "No, Constable. I went straight home. I live alone, you see, so I have no one to confirm it, but I was marking homework until quite late." "Homework," echoed Blair with a snort. "Right. Well, we'll be wanting formal statements from everyone on this list, starting with the ones who threatened him directly." The forensics team arrived, and with them came the pathologist, a dour man named Ferguson, who examined the body with professional detachment. "Single blow," he announced. "Delivered from behind and slightly above. Your killer was either tall or standing on a higher ground. Death would have been instantaneous." "Time of death?" Blair demanded. "Sometime between 10 last night and 2 this morning. I'll narrow it down once I get him on the table." Blair rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. "Right. Macbeth. I want statements from every single person in this God-forsaken village, and I want them today." Hamish nodded slowly. Blair's enthusiasm for a quick arrest usually meant an innocent person would be harassed. While the real killer slipped away, he would have to work carefully, quietly, to ensure justice was actually served. As the body was loaded onto a stretcher and carried down the slope, Mary approached Hamish one last time. "It's probably nothing," she said hesitantly, "but I did wonder if it might have been a robbery. Mr. Vane was wearing an expensive gold watch yesterday. I couldn't help but notice it when he was gesturing at the pub. But I didn't see it on his wrist just now." Hamish glanced back at the crime scene. She was right. No watch. "That's very observant of you, Mrs. Sutherland." "I notice small things," she said with a modest smile. "It's part of being a teacher. Perhaps it was just a transient, someone passing through who saw an opportunity." "Perhaps," said Hamish, though he did not believe it for a moment. As Mary walked carefully back down the hill, Hamish stood watching the sun burn away the last of the mist. Somewhere in his quiet village, a killer was going about their morning routine, confident they had committed the perfect crime. But Hamish Macbeth had not kept his peaceful post for all these years by being as lazy as he appeared. He would find them in his own way, in his own time. And he would do it before Blair could arrest the wrong person. Chapter 3. Sifting the Highland Gossip. Hamish returned to the police station with the weight of the investigation settling on his shoulders like a damp Highland cloak. Blair would charge ahead like a bull in a china shop, trampling evidence and terrifying witnesses in his eagerness for headlines. Someone innocent would suffer unless Hamish could work quietly behind the scenes. He fed lugs and sonsie, made himself a strong cup of tea and settled down to think. The problem with Blair's approach was simple. He did not understand the Highlands. He saw only suspects and motives, not the intricate web of relationships that bound a village together. Push too hard in the wrong place, and the entire community would close ranks, protecting even the guilty out of sheer bloody-mindedness. Hamish needed information, and he needed it before Blair could poison the well. His first stop was the Curry sisters. Nessie and Jessie lived in a neat cottage on the harbour front, where they could observe the comings and goings of the entire village from their front window. They were not exactly gossips, Hamish told himself charitably. They were merely extremely well informed. Nessie answered the door, her twin sister hovering just behind her shoulder like an echo. "Constable Macbeth," said Nessie. "We've been expecting you." "Expecting you," confirmed Jessie. They ushered him into a sitting room so clean it gleamed, and produced tea and biscuits with the efficiency of women who had the ritual down to a fine art. "Terrible business," said Nessie, settling into her chair. "Terrible," agreed Jessie. "About Mr. Vane," Hamish prompted gently. "Oh, aye. Him." Nessie pursed her lips. "Not that we're speaking ill of the dead, mind." "Ill of the dead," Jessie echoed virtuously. "Of course not," said Hamish. "But I need to know what happened yesterday. Anything unusual?" The sisters exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. "Well," said Nessie slowly, "there was that argument at the harbour." "The harbour," confirmed Jessie. Hamish leaned forward. "What argument?" "After you left the pub. Mr. Vane went down to the harbour and there was a young man waiting for him. Dark hair, city clothes. They had words." "Had words?" Jessie nodded. "Could you hear what they were saying?" "Not clearly," Nessie admitted. "But the young man was angry. Very angry. Waving his arms about and such." "Arms about," said Jessie, demonstrating with her own. Did you recognise him?" Both sisters shook their heads in unison. "Never seen him before in Lockdube," said Nessie firmly. "Never before," Jessie confirmed. Hamish made a mental note. A stranger arguing with Vane on the night of his death was significant, though whether it pointed toward the mysterious young man or away from the villagers remained to be seen. He thanked the sisters and made his escape before they could offer him more tea and a comprehensive analysis of every slight and insult Vane had delivered during his brief stay. His next visit was to Angus MacDonald. Angus lived in a cottage that seemed to lean against the wind, surrounded by chicken wire and mysterious bundles of herbs. He claimed to have the second sight, a claim Hamish treated with the scepticism it deserved. But Angus also had an uncanny knack for knowing everyone's business, and Hamish was not above using that talent when it suited him. The old man was sitting outside despite the cold, smoking a pipe and staring at the sky as if reading prophecies in the clouds. "Hamish Macbeth," he said, without turning around. "Come about the murder, have you?" "How did you know I was here? Heard your Land Rover. Also saw your shadow, and I'm no daft." Angus turned and fixed Hamish with a rheumy eye. "The spirits have been restless." "Have they now?" "Oh, aye. Death on the moor, blood on the heather. Dark secrets coming home to roost." "Very poetic," said Hamish. "What do your spirits tell you about who killed Vane?" Angus sucked on his pipe thoughtfully. "The spirits don't deal in names, laddie. They deal in truth. And the truth is, well, that man brought his death with him when he came north." "Meaning?" "Meaning he wasn't killed for what he did here. He was killed for what he'd done before." Hamish considered this. "You've heard something." "I hear many things. The wind talks, you see." "Angus!" The old man grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. All right. I heard he was asking questions in Strathbane before he came to Lockdube, digging into land records, old deeds, that sort of thing, making a nuisance of himself. Do you know what he was looking for?" "No, but I know a man in the records office who might. For a consideration, you understand." Hamish sighed and pulled out his wallet. The price of information in the Highlands was usually measured in whisky or cash, and Angus preferred the latter for his so-called psychic services. "You'll have it by tomorrow," said Angus, pocketing the notes with satisfaction. "The spirits work faster when properly motivated." By the time Hamish returned to the police station, Blair had already arrested and released 3 people, terrorised half the village, and declared loudly that he would have the killer in custody by nightfall. Jimmy Anderson appeared at Hamish's door just after 6, looking harassed. "Got any of that good whisky?" he asked without preamble. Hamish poured them both a generous measure and waited. "Blair's lost his mind," Jimmy said after his first sip. "He's convinced it was Archie McLean. Found muddy boot prints near the body that match Archie's Wellingtons." "Half the men in Lockdube wear the same boots," Hamish observed. "Aye, I tried telling him that. He's having none of it. Says Archie had motive because Vane threatened to seize his harbour shed over some debt." Hamish frowned. "Archie has debts?" "Apparently Vane had documentation. Found it in his cottage this afternoon. Legal papers, threats, the whole business." "Can I see the autopsy report?" Jimmy hesitated, then pulled a folder from his jacket. "You didn't get this from me?" "Get what from you?" The autopsy confirmed what Hamish had suspected. Single blow, delivered with precision, death instantaneous. The angle suggested the killer had been standing slightly behind and to the right of the victim. Time of death between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning, with the pathologist favouring the earlier end of that range based on body temperature and rigor mortis. "What about the missing watch?" Hamish asked. "What watch?" "Mrs. Sutherland mentioned Vane was wearing an expensive gold watch yesterday. It wasn't on the body. Jimmy made a note. That's interesting. Blair thinks this was personal, not robbery. Blair thinks what he wants to think. True enough. Jimmy drained his glass and stood. Be careful, Hamish. Blair's got it in for you. He'd love nothing more than to prove you incompetent. After Jimmy left, Hamish sat in the growing darkness and thought about what he had learned. A mysterious stranger arguing with Vane. Old land records and deeds. A missing watch. Archie's boots at the scene. And through it all, Mrs. Mary Sutherland, helpful and observant, appearing at exactly the right moments with exactly the right information. There was something there, something his instincts were telling him to examine more closely. But what? Luggs whined softly and pressed his nose against Hamish's hand. You're right, Hamish told the dog. I'm thinking too hard. Let's go for a walk. They walked down to the harbour, where the fishing boats rocked gently at anchor, and the smell of salt and seaweed filled the air. Hamish stood looking out at the dark water and let his mind drift. In Beaton's novels, he thought wryly, the detective always had a moment of clarity, a flash of insight that solved everything. But real life was messier, full of contradictions and false trails and information that led nowhere. Still, he had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that Mary Sutherland bore watching. Kind, helpful, gentle Mary, who seemed to appear whenever something needed to be found or someone needed to be pointed in a particular direction. Hamish turned and headed back to the station, his mind already working on how to investigate the sweet schoolteacher without alerting Blair or alarming the village. It would take delicacy, patience, and a careful touch. Fortunately, he thought with a slight smile, those were skills he had cultivated over many years of avoiding promotions and maintaining the peace in Lockdube. Tomorrow, he would begin to dig deeper. Tonight, he would feed his animals, have a simple dinner, and let his subconscious work on the puzzle while he slept. In the Highlands, as in detection, rushing got you nowhere. The trick was to move slowly, watch carefully, and wait for the truth to reveal itself. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. The morning brought rain, the sort of persistent Highland drizzle that soaked through clothes and dampened spirits. Hamish stood at his kitchen window, watching the grey curtains sweep across the loch, and considered his next move. Blair would be focusing on Archie McLean, convinced the muddy boot prints were the key to a quick conviction, which meant Hamish had a narrow window to conduct his own investigation before Blair's ham-fisted approach made everyone in Lockdube retreat behind a wall of Highland stubbornness. The autopsy results had been filed, and Jimmy had slipped Hamish a copy along with his morning report. Death had occurred closer to 10 o'clock than 2, the pathologist now believed, based on the contents of Vane's stomach and the rate of cooling in the cold night air. A precise, professional blow, no hesitation marks, no signs of a struggle. This was not a crime of passion, despite what Blair wanted to believe. This was execution. Hamish pulled on his waterproof jacket and drove to Vane's rented cottage, a modern monstrosity perched on the hillside with floor-to-ceiling windows that must have cost a fortune to heat. Blair's team had finished their search the previous day, sealing the place and posting a constable at the door. The constable was young McGregor from Strathbane, who looked miserable and waterlogged. "Morning, constable," said Hamish cheerfully. "Terrible weather for standing guard." "Aye, sir. DCI Blair's orders. No one in or out." Of course. I just need to check one small thing. Won't be a moment." McGregor hesitated. Technically, Hamish outranked him, being the local officer. But Blair's temper was legendary. "I suppose it would be all right," he said reluctantly, "seeing as you're official and all." "Very wise," said Hamish, and let himself in before the young man could reconsider. The cottage was exactly what he had expected. Expensive furniture, no personal touches, the sort of place that could be rented by the month with nothing to show who actually lived there. Blair's team had left their usual mess, fingerprint powder on every surface and papers scattered across the dining table. Hamish moved through the rooms methodically, looking for what Blair would have missed. The man had no imagination, no sense of how people actually lived or where they might hide their secrets. In the bedroom, behind a frame print of Edinburgh Castle that was slightly crooked, Hamish found what he was looking for, a wall safe, small and modern, already opened by Blair's team. But Blair, in his haste, had overlooked something. Hamish crouched down and examined the safe's interior with his torch. There, wedged in the back corner behind the hanging folder mechanism, was a small leather notebook. He pulled it out carefully and flipped through the pages. It was a ledger written in Vane's neat, precise hand. Names, dates, amounts, but not accounts receivable or business expenses. These were something far more sinister. Hamish's blood ran cold as he read. Archie McLean owes £3,000 for harbour shed repairs, purchased materials under false name, evidence, receipts from Glasgow supplier, forged signature. Dr. Brodie, medical negligence, 1998. Patient died of misdiagnosed appendicitis. Covered up by hospital board. Evidence, witness statements, original death certificate. Mrs. Elizabeth Dunn, illegitimate child given up for adoption, 1972. Husband never told. Evidence, adoption records, birth certificate. The list went on, each entry more damning than the last. Vane had not been a carbon offset consultant. He had been a predator, using his access to land records and legal documents to dig up secrets and extort money from people who could not afford to fight back. Hamish sat back on his heels, the notebook heavy in his hands. This changed everything. Half the village had reason to want Vane dead, and all of them had been backed into corners with no way out. He photographed each page with his mobile phone, then carefully replaced the notebook exactly where he had found it. Blair would discover it eventually. Dan or Hamish would find a way to direct him toward it. But for now, the information was more useful if Hamish alone knew what it contained. Outside, young McGregor was huddled against the cottage wall, trying to shelter from the rain. "All done, sir?" "Aye, just checking the window locks. You know how thorough Blair likes things." McGregor nodded miserably, and Hamish left him to his soggy vigil. Back at the station, Hamish made fresh coffee and studied the photographs on his phone. The scope of Vane's blackmail operation was breathtaking. He had targeted at least a dozen people in Lochdoub alone, and there were references to similar schemes in other villages. The man had been systematic, methodical, and utterly without conscience, which meant his killer could be any one of a dozen desperate people. Hamish was still mulling over this problem when Blair burst through the door without knocking, his face purple with triumph. "Got him," Blair bellowed. "Found Archie McLean's boot prints all over that hillside. Forensics matched the tread pattern perfectly. He's coming in for formal questioning this afternoon, and I'll have a confession by dinner. Sir, I really think—" "You think nothing, Macbeth. I'm the detective here, not you. Stick to directing traffic and finding lost sheep," Blair stormed out, leaving a wake of self-satisfaction and expensive cologne. Hamish sighed. Archie was innocent, of that he was certain. The fisherman might have had motive, and his boots might have left prints at the scene, but Archie McLean was not a killer. He was a man who hid in pub cellars to avoid his wife. Not a man who could crush a skull with cold precision. The real question was whether the killer had deliberately planted the boot prints to frame Archie, or whether Archie had simply been unlucky enough to walk near the crime scene at the wrong time. Hamish was considering this when Mrs. Sutherland appeared at the door carrying a covered dish. "Constable Macbeth," she said with her gentle smile. "I made too much stew last night, and I thought you might enjoy some. You work so hard, and I'm sure you don't always have time for proper meals." The stew smelled wonderful, rich with lamb and vegetables. Hamish accepted it gratefully. "You're very kind, Mrs. Sutherland. Please call me Mary. We're all friends here in Lochdoub." She settled into the visitor's chair with the ease of someone who felt entirely comfortable. "I heard DCI Blair thinks it was Archie. Such a shame. Archie's a good man, just a bit henpecked." "These things take time to sort out," Hamish said carefully. "Of course. though I can't help thinking about that young man I saw arguing with Mr. Vane at the harbour. The stranger. Has anyone identified him yet? Hamish looked up sharply. You saw him too? Oh, yes. I was walking home from the school when I noticed them. Dark hair, well-dressed, very agitated. They were standing by Archie's shed, actually, which might explain the boot prints if Archie went to check on his property afterward. It was a neat explanation. Too neat. Did you mention this to DCI Blair? Mary's eyes widened. Should I have? I assumed someone else would have told him. The Curry sisters see everything after all. It might be helpful, Hamish said. Can you describe the stranger in more detail? Tall, perhaps in his 30s, expensive overcoat, the sort you see in Edinburgh. He had a leather satchel, I remember, because he kept hitting it against his leg while they argued. Could you hear what they were saying? Not clearly, but the young man said something about blood money and what you owe. I assumed it was a business matter. After Mary left, Hamish sat staring at the wall. The mysterious stranger was becoming more substantial, more real. But was he a suspect or simply another of Vane's victims? And why was Mary so intent on directing attention toward him? Hamish opened his computer and began searching through missing persons reports, recent releases from prison, anyone who might have a connection to Vane and a reason to travel to Lochdoub. It took 3 hours, but he finally found him. Callum Vane, age 32, last known address in Edinburgh, Alistair Vane's nephew. According to the sparse information available, Callum had racked up significant gambling debts and had been making increasingly desperate attempts to contact his wealthy uncle. Hamish sat back, fitting pieces together. A nephew with debts, an uncle with money and no conscience, a confrontation at the harbour. It was plausible. But it was also convenient, and Hamish had learned long ago to be suspicious of convenient answers. He needed to find Callum Vane and hear his story, and he needed to do it before Blair arrested Archie and closed the case. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the station windows like a reminder that time was running out. Chapter 5. Expanding the Suspect Pool. Hamish found Archie McLean exactly where he expected, hiding in the back room of the Lochdoub pub, nursing a half-pint and looking like a man awaiting execution. "They're coming for me," Archie said without preamble. "That fat bastard from Strathbane thinks I killed the Englishman." "Did you?" Archie looked up, startled. "What? No, I never went near the moor that night." "Then where were you?" The fisherman's weathered face turned a dull red. "In the cellar, here, all night. Hiding from your wife. She was in a rare temper about the money Vane was demanding. Thought I'd best make myself scarce until she calmed down." Archie took a morose sip of his beer. "Fat lot of good it did me. Now I'm a murder suspect." Hamish pulled up a chair. "Tell me about the debt." "What's to tell?" "I needed materials for the harbour shed repairs 3 years back. Ordered them under a different name because my credit was no good. Vane found out somehow, said it was fraud, threatened to have me arrested unless I paid him £3,000. Archie's voice cracked. "Where would I get £3,000? "So you argued with him?" "Aye, at the pub, in front of God and everyone. Told him he could go to hell and take his threats with him." Which, Hamish reflected, was exactly the sort of public confrontation that would make Archie look guilty. "And after the pub, you went straight to the cellar?" "Straight down. Ask the landlord if you don't believe me." Hamish believed him. Archie McLean was many things, but he was not a liar. The question was whether anyone else would believe it, especially with his boot prints scattered across the crime scene. "When did you last wear those Wellingtons near the old Sinclair Croft?" Archie frowned, thinking. 2, maybe 3 weeks ago. I was checking on some lost lobster pots that washed up on the rocks nearby, which meant the prints could have been left well before the murder, or Archie could have walked past the scene the next morning without realising what he was stepping into. Either way, it was thin evidence for a conviction. But Blair did not need solid evidence. He needed a warm body and a plausible narrative, and Archie fit both requirements. Hamish left the pub and drove to the surgery, where Dr. Brodie was seeing patients with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been practising medicine in the Highlands for 30 years. The waiting room was empty except for old Mrs. McBean, who was describing her various ailments in exhaustive detail to the receptionist. "Dr. Brodie will see you in a moment, Constable," the receptionist said with relief, clearly grateful for the interruption. Hamish settled into a chair with a 3-month-old copy of Scottish Field and waited. When Mrs. McBean finally emerged, clutching a prescription and still talking, Dr. Brodie appeared in the doorway looking harassed. "Hamish, come in." The surgery was neat and impersonal, with anatomical charts on the walls and the faint smell of antiseptic in the air. Dr. Brodie was a slight man with thinning hair and the perpetually worried expression of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "This is about Vane," he said, closing the door. I didn't kill him, if that's what you're wondering." "I'm not wondering. I'm asking where you were that night between 10 and midnight." Dr. Brodie relaxed slightly. "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington at the manse. We have a regular game every Tuesday. I was there until well past midnight." "Can anyone else confirm that?" "Mrs. Wellington brought us tea around 11. She'll remember." That was solid. The Reverend and his wife were not the sort to lie, even to protect a friend. "What did Vane have on you?" Hamish asked gently. The doctor's face crumpled. "A mistake. 26 years ago, when I was still junior, a young woman came in with stomach pains. I diagnosed indigestion, sent her home. She died that night of a ruptured appendix. And Vane found out. He had witness statements, the original death certificate, everything. I threatened to send it all to the medical board unless I paid him £5,000. Dr. Brodie's hands shook. "I've carried that guilt every day since, but I couldn't pay. Not that kind of money." "Did you tell anyone about the threats?" "Only my wife. She wanted to go to the police, but was afraid it would all come out anyway." Hamish made notes, though he already knew Dr. Brodie was not his killer. The man was too broken by guilt, too weighed down by an ancient mistake to strike out with the cold precision that had ended Vane's life. His third interview of the day was with Callum Vane, whom Hamish tracked down to a bed and breakfast in Strathbane. The nephew was indeed tall, dark-haired and well-dressed, though his expensive clothes looked slept in, and his face was grey with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "Mr. Vane," said Hamish, "I'm Police Constable Macbeth from Lochdoub. I need to ask you some questions about your uncle. He's dead, isn't he? The papers said someone killed him." "Aye. Were you close?" Callum laughed bitterly. "Close? Uncle Alistair wouldn't give me the time of day. I came up here to ask him for help with some debts, and he told me to sort out my own mess." He ran a hand through his hair. "We argued at the harbour. I suppose someone told you that." "Several people saw you. I'm sure they did. I wasn't exactly quiet about it. Called him every name I could think of and told him he was sitting on money he'd stolen from better people than himself." "Stolen?" "His whole business model was extortion dressed up as consulting. He'd find people's vulnerabilities and squeeze them dry. I knew what he was, and I still came begging. That's how desperate I was." There was genuine self-loathing in his voice. "Where were you between 10 and midnight on the night he died?" "Driving back to Edinburgh. I left Lochdoub around 8, stopped for petrol in Inverness around 9:30, and was back in my flat by 1 in the morning." Callum pulled out his phone. "I can show you the petrol receipt, and my car went through the speed camera on the A9 at 10:45. I couldn't have been in 2 places at once." Hamish examined the receipts and made note of the timestamps. The alibi was solid, assuming the traffic cameras confirmed it. "Did your uncle have any other enemies? Anyone who might want him dead? Besides everyone he'd ever met?" Callum shook his head. "He was brilliant at making enemies, but I don't know specifics. We hadn't spoken in years before I came up here." Back in Lochdoub, Hamish sat in his Land Rover and reviewed what he had learned. 3 suspects, 3 solid alibis. Archie hiding in a pub cellar, Dr. Brodie playing cards with the minister, Callum Vane on the A9 captured by traffic cameras, which left him back where he started with a village full of people who had motive but no apparent opportunity. Unless he was looking at this wrong, unless the person he should be investigating was not the obvious suspects with their public grievances, but someone quieter, Someone who had stayed in the background while carefully directing attention elsewhere. Someone like Mary Sutherland. Hamish pulled out his phone and called Jimmy Anderson. "I need you to check something for me," he said, quietly, without telling Blair. "What sort of something?" "Run a background check on Mrs. Mary Sutherland. Employment history, previous addresses, family connections, anything you can find." "The school teacher? Hamish, she's about as dangerous as a kitten." "Humour me," Jimmy sighed. "All right, but if Blair finds out I'm running checks on his star witness, he'll have both our heads." "He won't find out." Hamish ended the call and sat watching the rain stream down the windscreen. Somewhere in the tangle of motives and alibis was a thread he was missing, a connection that would make everything clear. He just needed to find it before Blair charged Archie McLean with murder and closed the case. The rain drummed on, indifferent to human concerns, while Hamish Macbeth began to plan his next move in the deadly game playing out in the heather-clad hills of Sutherland. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. The arrest came at dawn, with all the subtlety of a Highland thunderstorm. Hamish was feeding his chickens when he heard the sirens, an obscene sound in the quiet morning air. He watched from his garden as 2 police cars roared past, heading toward Archie McLean's cottage on the harbour front. By the time Hamish reached the scene, Blair had already hauled Archie out in handcuffs, ignoring the fishermen's protests and the gathering crowd of outraged villagers. "Archie McLean," Blair announced loudly, playing to his audience. "I am arresting you for the murder of Alistair Vane. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention when questioned something which you later rely on in court." "I never killed anyone," Archie shouted, his face white with shock. "Tell it to the magistrate," Blair said smugly. "We've got you dead to rights. Bootprints, motive, opportunity, open and shut." Mrs. McLean appeared in the doorway, her formidable presence momentarily silencing even Blair. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, her voice cold as winter. "My husband is many things, but he is not a murderer." "Evidence says otherwise, Mrs." Hamish stepped forward. "Sir, I really think we should consider—" "Macbeth!" Blair rounded on him like a bull spotting red. "This is my case, my arrest and my collar. If you had done your job properly in the first place, we might have had him sooner. Now get out of my way." They bundled Archie into the car and drove off, leaving Hamish standing in the rain with a crowd of angry villagers demanding he do something. "I will," he promised them quietly. "But I need time." The problem was, time was exactly what he did not have. Back at the station, Hamish paced the floor while Luggs watched with mournful eyes. Blair's case was circumstantial at best, but it might be enough for a conviction if Hamish could not find the real killer. He was still pacing when his mobile rang. "Hamish," it was Jimmy Anderson, his voice low and urgent. "I've got that background check you wanted on Mrs. Sutherland. You're going to want to hear this." "Go on." "She wasn't always Sutherland. Born Mary Ferguson in Edinburgh. Married young, widowed at 30 when her husband died in a car accident. No children. Moved to Loughdoob 12 years ago and took a teaching post. That's all public record, what else? Here's the interesting bit. Her father was Douglas Ferguson, a property developer in Edinburgh. In 1985, he was involved in a major land deal that went bad. Lost everything, including the family estate near Loughdoob. The land was sold to pay creditors. Douglas Ferguson committed suicide 6 months later. Hamish's pulse quickened. Who bought the land? A development company called Vane Enterprises, owned by Alistair Vane's father. The very same. The Vanes made a fortune developing that land, while the Fergusons lost everything. Hamish thanked Jimmy and ended the call, his mind racing. Mary had a motive, one that went back decades. But did she have opportunity? He was pondering this question when he spotted movement on the moor through his window. Someone was moving furtively through the heather, carrying something bulky. Hamish grabbed his torch and slipped out the back door. The figure was Dr. Brodie, thus struggling through the wet heather with a heavy burlap sack slung over his shoulder. He kept glancing around nervously, clearly unaware he was being followed. Hamish waited until the doctor reached a sheltered spot behind a rocky outcrop before stepping out of the shadows. "Working late, Doctor?" Dr. Brodie nearly dropped his burden. "Hamish, Good God, you scared the life out of me. What's in the sack? The doctor's face went from white to red. Nothing. Just rubbish. Rubbish that you're burying in the middle of the moor at night? It's not what you think. Then show me. Dr. Brodie set down the sack with a heavy sigh and opened it. Inside was the gutted remains of a large salmon, its flesh still fresh. Poaching, said Hamish. Just the one, the doctor said miserably. From the Laird stream. I couldn't help myself. It was such a beautiful fish, and my wife has been nagging me about fresh salmon for weeks. But now she's got her church ladies coming for lunch tomorrow, and if she sees a poached salmon in the house, she'll know exactly where it came from. So I thought I'd just dispose of it quietly. By burying it where someone might think it was connected to a murder investigation? I wasn't thinking clearly, Dr. Brodie admitted. The whole business with Vane has had me on edge. When Blair arrested Archie this morning, I panicked. Thought if anyone found this, they might think, well, I don't know what they'd think, but it wouldn't be good. Hamish looked at the pathetic figure of the doctor, clutching his illegal salmon like a guilty schoolboy, and made a decision. Go home, he said. Bury it in your garden if you must. But for God's sake, and don't go sneaking around the moors in the dark. You'll give yourself a heart attack. You're not going to report it? Report what? I never saw you tonight. Dr. Brodie's relief was palpable. Thank you, Hamish. I know it's not by the book, but... The book, said Hamish, doesn't always account for common sense. Now go before someone else spots you. The doctor scurried off into the darkness, and Hamish stood alone in the heather, reflecting on the peculiar demands of Highland justice. The law said poaching was poaching, to be prosecuted regardless of circumstance. But Hamish had learned long ago that rigid application of the law could do more harm than good in a small community. Better to exercise discretion, to preserve the delicate balance that allowed people to live together in peace. It was why he was good at his job, and why Blair would never understand what that job actually entailed. He was walking back to the station when he noticed a light burning in the village library. That was odd. The library closed at 5, and it was nearly 9 o'clock. Hamish tried the door and found it unlocked. Inside, the small reading room was empty except for Mary Sutherland, who was kneeling beside the heritage display, carefully cleaning the now empty spot where the antique peat cutter had once rested. Mrs. Sutherland, said Hamish. Working late? She looked up, startled, then smiled. Constable. Yes, I thought I should tidy up. The display looks so bare without the peat cutter, but I can hardly replace it while it's evidence. You have a key to the library? Of course. I'm on the Historical Society Committee. We maintain the displays. She stood, he brushing dust from her skirt. Is there something I can help you with? Just wondering if you remembered anything else about the night Mr. Vane died. I've been thinking about it constantly, Mary said. Such a terrible thing to happen in our peaceful village. But no, I'm afraid I can't think of anything new. I've told DCI Blair everything I know. Hamish studied her carefully. She looked tired, her usually neat hair slightly dishevelled, her eyes shadowed with what might have been grief or might have been guilt. You knew the land Vane was developing used to belong to your family, he said quietly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mary's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. That was a very long time ago, Constable, before I was even born. But you knew. Of course I knew. My father lost everything to the Vanes' business dealings, but that's ancient history. It has nothing to do with what happened to Alistair Vane. Doesn't it? No, said Mary firmly, it doesn't. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have marking to finish before tomorrow. She gathered her things and swept past him with surprising speed, leaving Hamish alone in the silent library. He stood there for a long moment, thinking about family secrets and old grievances, about justice and revenge, about the difference between the two. Then he locked the library door behind him and walked out into the rainy night, more convinced than ever that he was on the right track. But conviction was not proof, and proof was what he needed if he was going to save Archie MacLean and catch a killer who had been planning this for a very long time. Chapter 7. ironclad alibis. The magistrate denied bail, which surprised no one except possibly Archie himself, who had maintained a stubborn faith in British justice right up until the cell door clanged shut. Hamish spent a sleepless night reviewing everything he knew, spreading his notes across the kitchen table, while Lugg snored at his feet and Sonsey prowled the countertops with feline disapproval. The facts were simple enough. Vane had been killed between 10 and midnight, most likely closer to 10. The murder weapon had been taken from the library display. The killer had navigated the dark moor with confidence, struck once with precision, and vanished without leaving useful evidence. The suspects all had motives. Most had alibis, but alibis could be verified, and that was where Hamish intended to start. He began with Archie driving to Strathbane in the grey dawn to interview the pub landlord, a taciturn man named Macpherson, who ran the Lochdoub establishment with the efficiency of a drill sergeant. "Aye, Archie was in my cellar that night," Macpherson confirmed. "Came down around 9:30, said his wife was on the warpath about money troubles. I told him he could stay as long as he liked, provided he didn't touch the stock." "And he stayed all night?" "Until I locked up at midnight. He was still down there when I went home. Found him asleep on a pile of grain sacks the next morning, complaining about his back." "You're certain about the time?" "Positive. I always lock up at 12:30 on weeknights. Been doing it for 20 years, which meant Archie could not have killed Vane and returned to the cellar without Macpherson noticing. The alibi was solid, assuming Macpherson was telling the truth, and Hamish had no reason to doubt him. Dr. Brodie's alibi proved equally sound. The Reverend Wellington confirmed the card game, and Mrs. Wellington remembered bringing them tea at 11 o'clock precisely because she had been watching the news. Such a pleasant evening, she recalled. The doctor was quite relaxed, winning hands left and right. "I do think it's good for him to get away from his work now and then. He takes everything so seriously." Hamish thanked her and moved on to his final check. The traffic cameras on the A9. Jimmy Anderson had already pulled the footage at Hamish's request, and they reviewed it together in Jimmy's cramped Strathbane office, squinting at grainy images on a computer screen. "There," said Jimmy, pointing. "That's Callum Vane's BMW. Timestamp shows 22:45, just like he said. He couldn't have been in Lochdoub at 10 o'clock and on the A9 45 minutes later, not unless he had a helicopter." Hamish leaned back in his chair, frustrated. 3 solid alibis, all confirmed by independent sources, which left him with a village full of potential suspects and no clear path forward. "What about the school teacher?" Jimmy asked. "Find anything interesting?" "She had motive. Her family lost everything to Vane's father, but I can't prove opportunity." "Does she have an alibi?" "She says she was home alone marking homework, no witnesses." Jimmy whistled softly. "Bit convenient, that." "Aye, but convenient isn't proof." Hamish returned to Lochdoub in a foul mood, which was not improved by finding Blair waiting at the police station, radiating smugness like a miniature sun. "Come to congratulate me, Macbeth? Got our man behind bars, case closed. I'll be recommending a commendation for efficient police work." "Archie McLean has an alibi," Hamish said flatly. "Rubbish. You just don't like admitting I solved your murder for you." "The pub landlord confirms Archie was in the cellar from 9:30 until after midnight. He couldn't have killed Vane." Blair's face turned an interesting shade of purple. The landlord's lying, covering for his customer. These Highland types stick together. "Macpherson has no reason to lie. He's not from Lochdoub originally, and he runs his pub by the rules. If Archie had left the cellar, Macpherson would have seen him. Then Archie killed Vane before 9:30 and planted the boot prints later to throw us off. The time of death was after 10 o'clock. The pathologist was very clear." Blair spluttered, searching for a counter-argument and finding none. Finally he jabbed a finger at Hamish's chest. "You're trying to make me look incompetent. I'm trying to catch the real killer before an innocent man goes to prison. Archie McLean is guilty, and I'll prove it at trial. Now get out of my way, I have real police work to do." Blair stormed out, leaving Hamish alone with the sinking feeling that the detective chief inspector would rather convict an innocent man than admit he was wrong. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Nessie and Jessie Curry appeared at the station bearing a cake tin, and expressions of determined helpfulness. "We've been thinking," said Nessie. "Thinking," echoed Jessie. "About the murder," Nessie continued, "and we remembered something odd." Hamish offered them tea and waited. "The night Mr. Vane died," said Nessie, "we saw Mrs. Sutherland walking past our house around 9:30. "9:30," Jessie confirmed, "walking toward the moor path." "The moor path." Hamish set down his cup carefully. "Are you certain about the time?" "Oh, yes," said Nessie. "We were watching the end of our programme. It finishes at 9:30 on the dot." "And you're sure it was Mrs. Sutherland?" "Positive," said Nessie. "She was wearing that green coat of hers, the one with the hood. And she was carrying something." "Carrying something," Jessie agreed. "What sort of something?" The sisters looked at each other. "We couldn't quite see," Nessie admitted, "but it looked heavy, like a bag or a satchel." After they left, Hamish sat very still, thinking hard. Mary had said she was home all evening marking homework. But if the Curry sisters were right, she had been out walking toward the moor at precisely the time when Vane was being murdered. It still was not proof. She could have been taking a walk, enjoying the evening air. The heavy bag could have been anything. But it was suspicious. Very suspicious indeed. Hamish pulled out his mobile and called Jimmy Anderson again. "I need forensics to go back to the crime scene," he said. "Tell them to look for traces of coloured chalk and wallpaper. Specifically, the kind used in primary school displays. Chalk and wallpaper? Hamish, have you lost your mind? Just do it. And don't tell Blair. I'm going to regret this, aren't I? Probably." Hamish ended the call and walked to the window, watching the village go about its afternoon routine. Children played in the street. The Curry sisters emerged from the bakery with fresh bread. Archie's wife stood on her doorstep, arms folded, staring at nothing. And somewhere in this peaceful scene was a killer who had waited decades for revenge. He needed one more piece of evidence, one solid connection between Mary and the crime scene, something that would force her to explain herself, to drop the gentle facade and reveal the truth. The answer came to him as he was feeding lugs that evening. The library display. Mary had been cleaning it when he found her there. But why would she need to clean it if she had not been the one to take the peat cutter? Unless she was removing evidence of her visit. Hamish grabbed his keys and drove to the library, letting himself in with the spare key he kept for emergencies. The heritage display sat in its usual corner, looking forlorn without its centrepiece. He examined the shelf where the peat cutter had rested, using his torch to illuminate every surface. And there, in the back corner where the shelf met the wall, was a tiny scrap of fabric. Green wool, the same colour as Mary's coat. Hamish photographed it, bagged it, and labelled it with meticulous care. It was not much, but combined with the Curry sisters' testimony and the forensics results he was hoping for, it might be enough to crack Mary's story. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. All he needed now was patience, and the courage to confront a woman who had been kind to him, who had brought him scones and sympathy, who had spent 12 years in Lochdu waiting for her chance at revenge. Tomorrow he would begin to tighten the net. Tonight he would rest and prepare for the confrontation to come. Chapter 8. The Schoolteacher's Flaw. Jimmy Anderson called at 8 the next morning, his voice crackling with excitement over the mobile connection. "You were right," he said without preamble. "Forensics found traces of coloured chalk at the crime scene. Blue and yellow, the kind used in children's classrooms. And there were microscopic fibres of vintage wallpaper stuck to the peat cutter's handle. The pattern matches samples from the library heritage display." Hamish felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Can they identify who handled the display recently? They're running tests now. But Hamish, there's more. I pulled Mary Sutherland's employment records like you asked. Before she came to Lochdu, she taught in Edinburgh for 8 years. Want to guess which school? Tell me. St. Margaret's Academy, where Alistair Vane's daughter was a pupil. Mary would have known the family, known their business dealings, had access to all sorts of information about them. The pieces were falling into place with deadly precision. What else did you find? I did some digging into the old Ferguson estate sale, the land that Vane Enterprises bought. It wasn't just any land. There was an archaeological survey done in the 1980s that identified potential Viking burial sites. Douglas Ferguson, Mary's father, had been planning to develop it as a heritage site before the bankruptcy. It would have been worth millions. And the Vanes knew about it? They must have. They sat on the land for 30 years, and suddenly Alistair Vane comes north claiming he wants to do carbon offset restoration work. But what if he was really planning to develop those Viking sites himself? Make the fortune his father started? Hamish thought about the blackmail ledger, about Vane's systematic exploitation of everyone he met. He found out Mary was Douglas Ferguson's daughter, realised she'd been living in Lockdoob all these years, close to her family's lost land. And he used it against her, Jimmy finished. Probably threatened to expose whatever her father did before the suicide. These old business failures often involve dodgy dealings. Has Blair seen any of this? Are you joking? He's too busy preparing his case against Archie. I've kept everything on the quiet, like you asked. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat at his kitchen table and reviewed the timeline Mary had provided to DCI Blair. She had written down every person Vane had threatened, every argument he'd had, presented it all on a neat piece of paper as if she were simply being helpful. But now Hamish looked at it with fresh eyes. There, in the middle of her detailed account, was a reference to Vane researching native plant species on the moor, specifically mentioning a rare variety of heather that grew near the old Sinclair Croft. Hamish pulled out his phone and searched for the plant she'd named. It took 10 minutes of browsing botanical websites before he found it. Calluna vulgaris var. Alba, white heather, once common in Sutherland but extinct in that particular region since the early 1970s. Mary, as a member of the Historical Society and an amateur botanist, would have known that. She would have known the plant could not possibly be growing where she claimed Vane had been researching it. It was a small lie, almost insignificant. But it revealed something crucial. Mary had been planting false information from the very beginning, directing the investigation away from herself by providing helpful details that seemed concrete but were subtly wrong. The threatening note allegedly written by Archie was another example. Hamish pulled it from his evidence file and examined it closely. The handwriting was rough, barely literate, exactly what one might expect from a simple fisherman. But Archie, despite his gruff manner, had actually attended university for 2 years before family circumstances forced him home. He wrote in a neat, educated hand. Hamish had seen his fishing logs. This note was a forgery. And not a particularly good one if you knew what to look for. Hamish photographed the note and sent it to Jimmy with a request for handwriting analysis. The reply came back within the hour. Preliminary comparison suggested the note had been written by someone trying to disguise their natural hand, with several characteristics matching known samples of Mary Sutherland's writing from school records. It was time to search Mary's cottage. Hamish drove to the neat bungalow on the edge of the village, noting the carefully tended garden and the lace curtains in the windows. The cottage was empty, Mary being at school for the afternoon session. He let himself in with the search warrant he'd obtained that morning from a magistrate in Strathbane, carefully documenting his entry. The cottage was exactly what he expected. Tasteful furniture, books on every surface, photographs of landscapes and flowers, but none of people. It was the home of someone who had deliberately chosen solitude, who had cut ties with the past. Or so it appeared. In the bedroom, hidden at the back of the wardrobe behind a row of sensible shoes, Hamish found a locked wooden box. It took him 5 minutes to pick the simple lock, a skill he had learned in his youth and rarely had occasion to use. Inside were the remnants of Mary's previous life. Photographs of a younger woman with a tall, distinguished man who had to be her father. Newspaper clippings about the Ferguson estate sale and subsequent bankruptcy. A death certificate for Douglas Ferguson. Cause of death listed as suicide by hanging. And at the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small leather journal. Hamish opened it carefully and began to read. It was a diary started the year Mary moved to Lockdoob. The entries were sporadic at first, dealing with settling into the village, learning to teach in a small rural school, making friends with locals who had no idea who she really was. Then, 5 years ago, the entries changed. I've discovered that the old family land still sits undeveloped. The Vanes did nothing with it except hold it as an asset. All those years, all that suffering, and they simply sat on it like dragons hoarding gold. Father would weep to see it. 3 years ago, I've heard rumours that Alistair Vane is planning something with the land. After all this time, they want to profit from what they stole. I cannot allow it. I will not allow it. 1 year ago, I've been studying the moor paths, learning every stone and shadow. If the time comes, I will be ready. I will make them pay for what they did to my family. And finally, dated 2 weeks before Vane's arrival, he's coming. Alistair Vane himself, coming to survey the land, to plan his exploitation of what should have been ours. This is my chance. After 12 years of waiting, watching, planning, this is my chance for justice. Hamish closed the diary and sat very still. This was not the ranting of a madwoman. It was the careful documentation of a long, patient campaign. Mary had moved to Lochdoub deliberately, positioning herself close to her family's lost heritage, waiting for the opportunity to strike. She had cultivated her reputation as a kind, gentle schoolteacher. She had made herself indispensable to the village, a trusted figure above suspicion. And when Vane finally came, she had been ready. Hamish photographed every page of the diary, every photograph, every scrap of evidence. Then he carefully replaced everything exactly as he had found it. He needed to confront Mary, but he needed to do it carefully. She had spent years planning this, and she would not break easily. More importantly, he needed to ensure Blair could not claim credit for the investigation, while simultaneously ensuring Archie was released. It would require careful timing and a delicate touch. Hamish locked the cottage behind him and drove back to the station, his mind already working on how to orchestrate the final confrontation. The trap was set. Now he just needed to spring it at precisely the right moment. In the meantime, he had a diary full of evidence, fibres and chalk from the crime scene. There's a forged note, and a timeline that placed Mary on the moor at the exact time of the murder. It was enough. More than enough. Tomorrow, he would end this. Tonight, he would prepare for the conversation that would finally reveal the truth behind the death in the heather. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Hamish spent the evening going through the land registry records that Angus MacDonald's contact had procured for a reasonable fee. What he found there completed the picture with devastating clarity. The Ferguson estate had been sold in 1985 for a fraction of its value. The family, desperate to pay creditors after Douglas Ferguson's business partners had systematically bankrupted the company through a series of fraudulent contracts. The investigation at the time had cleared Vane Enterprises of any wrongdoing, but the documents told a different story. Buried in the fine print were clauses that had trapped Ferguson in impossible obligations, agreements that could only have been designed to force a default. The Vanes had not simply bought the land. They had engineered its acquisition through calculated malice, and the land itself was worth far more than anyone had realised. The archaeological survey Jimmy had mentioned was only part of it. Beneath the heather and peat lay mineral deposits that had been discovered in a private geological assessment commissioned by Alistair Vane just months before his death. He had been planning to strip mine the land his father had stolen, destroying forever the heritage site that Douglas Ferguson had dreamed of preserving. It was enough to drive anyone to murder. But understanding a motive was different from proving a crime, and Hamish needed absolute certainty before he made his move. He found it in the most unlikely place, the village library's checkout records. Mrs. McGregor, the elderly librarian, yet kept meticulous handwritten logs of every book borrowed, a practice she had maintained since computerization, claiming she did not trust machines to remember things properly. Hamish spread the ledgers across his kitchen table and began searching for patterns. There, 6 months before Vane's arrival, was Mary's signature beside a book titled Traditional Highland Weapons and Tools. She had borrowed it 3 times over the following months, always returning it promptly, always checking it out again within weeks. The peat cutter in the heritage display was featured prominently in the book's chapter on agricultural implements. She had been studying it, learning its weight and balance, preparing for the moment when she would use it. Further back in the records, Hamish found more damning evidence. Mary had systematically borrowed books on Highland navigation, wilderness survival, and local folklore about the old paths across the moor. She had been educating herself, preparing for a journey that required perfect knowledge of the terrain in darkness. The final piece came from an unexpected source, the school caretaker, who mentioned in passing that Mrs. Sutherland had asked to borrow the key to the library several times in recent months, claiming she needed to update the historical displays after hours when the children would not be disturbed. She had been practicing, Hamish realised, learning the exact location of the peat cutter, memorising the approach, ensuring she could retrieve it silently in the dark. This was not a crime of passion. This was a campaign of revenge conducted with military precision. The next morning, Hamish drove to Edinburgh and spent 4 hours in the archives of the Scottish Land Registry and the Bankruptcy Court. What he uncovered was worse than he had imagined. Douglas Ferguson had not merely lost his business and his land. He had been systematically destroyed by men who saw his vulnerability and exploited it. The Vanes had been partners in this destruction, working with other developers to force the sale at the lowest possible price. Ferguson's suicide note, which Hamish obtained from the court records, spoke of shame and betrayal, of watching his family's heritage dissolve while predators circled. He had specifically named Vane Enterprises as the architects of his ruin. Young Mary would have been 13 when her father died, old enough to understand, old enough to hate, old enough to remember. She had carried that hatred for 37 years. On his way back to Lochdew, Hamish stopped at a cafe in Inverness and called Jimmy Anderson. "I need you to do something for me," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to tell Blair you found evidence that Archie's alibi is genuine. Tell him the timeline doesn't work, that he needs to release Archie before the case falls apart. He'll never listen to me. He will if you present it as his idea. Tell him that prosecuting an innocent man will ruin his reputation when the truth comes out. Blair cares about one thing above all else. His career. Appeal to that." Jimmy was silent for a moment. "And what will you be doing while I'm managing Blair?" "Getting a confession. Hamish, I know what I'm doing, Jimmy. Trust me." He ended the call before Jimmy could argue further. That evening, Hamish found Mary in her classroom marking papers at her desk while the autumn light faded outside the windows. She looked up as he entered, and for just a moment he saw something flicker behind her gentle eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. "Constable Macbeth," she said pleasantly. "This is unexpected. Is there something I can help you with?" "I think we need to talk, Mary, about your father." The pencil in her hand stopped moving. "My father has been dead for a very long time." "Aye, but what happened to him hasn't died, has it? It's been alive all these years, waiting for its moment." Mary set down the pencil with careful precision. "I don't know what you mean. Douglas Ferguson, the Ferguson estate, the land that should have been yours, and stolen by the Vanes through fraud and manipulation." She said nothing, but her hands had begun to tremble. "You came to Lochdew 12 years ago," Hamish continued, his voice gentle. "Not for the teaching job, not for the quiet Highland life. You came because this is where your family's land was, where your father's dreams died. You've been waiting all this time for Alistair Vane to return. You cannot prove any of this. I can prove you were on the moor the night he died. The Curry sisters saw you. I can prove you took the peat cutter from the library. Your fingerprints are on the display case, and fibres from your coat match samples I found at the scene. I can prove you forged the note from Archie McLean, and I can prove you've been studying that moor for years, learning every path. Preparing for this moment." Mary stood slowly, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. He deserved it. Maybe he did. He came here to destroy what little remained of my father's legacy. The land was going to be strip-mined. All those years of waiting, and he was going to tear it apart for profit, just like his father tore apart my family. So you killed him. I brought him justice. Her voice was steady now, all pretense of gentleness gone. Alistair Vane was a parasite who built his fortune on other people's misery. He blackmailed half of Lockdube, threatened good people with ruin. He was going to expose Dr. Brodie's ancient mistake, destroy Archie over a petty debt. The world is better without him. That may be true, said Hamish quietly, but murder is still murder. Is it, or is it execution? My father hanged himself because of what the Vanes did to him. I was 13 years old when I found his body in the barn. 13! I've lived with that image every day since. She moved to the window, looking out at the purple hills. I didn't plan it at first. I just wanted to be close to the land, to feel some connection to what we'd lost. But then I heard Alistair Vane was coming, and I realised this was my chance. Not just for revenge, but for justice. For my father. For everyone he'd ever hurt. How did you do it? Mary turned back to him, and in the fading light she looked older, harder. Nothing like the sweet schoolteacher the village knew. I waited for him on the moor. I knew he'd be there, surveying the land for his development plans. I took the peat cutter from the library, walked the path I'd memorised. Hi, and I struck him down. One blow. He never saw it coming. And then you came back and played the helpful witness, steering Blair toward everyone except yourself. It was remarkably easy. Blair is a fool. He saw what he wanted to see. Hamish pulled out his phone and stopped the recording. Mary Sutherland, I am arresting you for the murder of Alistair Vane. She smiled, a sad, distant expression. I suppose I always knew it would end this way. You're cleverer than you pretend to be, Constable Macbeth. And you're colder than you pretended to be, Mrs. Sutherland. As he led her from the classroom, Mary paused at the door and looked back at the neat rows of desks, the children's artwork on the walls. I was a good teacher, she said softly. Whatever else I was good at that. Aye, said Hamish. You were. It was. He reflected as they walked into the gathering darkness, the saddest truth of all. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The interview room at Strathbane Police Headquarters smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Hamish sat across from Mary Sutherland, the recording device running, while Jimmy Anderson observed from the corner and Blair paced like a caged animal. Mary had asked for no solicitor. She seemed almost relieved to finally tell her story in full, to lay down the burden she had carried for so many years. I took the peat cutter from the library on Tuesday afternoon, she said, her voice calm and measured. I knew the library would be empty between 4 and 5. I wrapped it in my coat and carried it to my cottage. That night I walked to the moor. I knew every step of the path. I'd practiced it dozens of times in the dark. And Vane was there waiting? Blair interrupted. Mary turned her cool gaze on him. I knew he would be. He told everyone at the pub about his plans to survey the land. He was arrogant enough to go alone, at night, thinking no one would dare challenge him. What did you say to him? Hamish asked quietly. I told him who I was, Douglas Ferguson's daughter. I wanted him to know why he was dying, to understand that this was justice, not random violence. Her hands lay still on the table. He laughed, called my father a fool and a weakling, said the Fergusons had deserved everything that happened to them. So you killed him. So I executed him. Mary's voice was steady. One blow, quick and clean. He fell without a sound. I left the peat cutter where it lay and walked home, changed my clothes, burned them in the fireplace and went to bed. I slept better that night than I had in 30 years. Blair could barely contain his excitement. And you planted evidence to frame Archie McLean? I did no such thing. Archie's boot prints were already there from when he'd walked the moor days earlier. I simply directed your attention toward them. The note was insurance, in case you proved more competent than I anticipated. She glanced at Blair with something like contempt, though that concern proved unfounded. Blair's face went purple. but Hamish spoke before he could explode. "What about the missing watch?" For the first time, Mary hesitated. "I threw it into the lock. It seemed wrong to profit from his death, but I couldn't leave it on his body. Someone might have robbed him afterward. And I didn't want the crime scene contaminated." "Very considerate," said Hamish dryly. "I'm not a monster, Constable. I'm a woman who saw a chance to right an old wrong, and I took it." After the interview concluded, Blair immediately began organising a press conference, crowing about how his brilliant detective work had cracked the case. Hamish let him talk, watching the performance with the weary recognition of a man who had seen this play out many times before. "Sir," he said mildly when Blair paused for breath, "I believe credit should go to Detective Inspector Anderson. He's the one who uncovered the connection between Mrs. Sutherland and the victim." Blair blinked, momentarily confused. "Anderson?" Jimmy caught on immediately. "Well, sir, it was really your insight that pointed me in the right direction. Your theory about the killer having intimate knowledge of the moor, that's what made me look into who had been studying the area." "Ah, yes, of course." Blair puffed up like a rooster. "My theory, exactly. Good work following my lead, Anderson." Hamish caught Jimmy's eye and saw the glimmer of suppressed laughter there. "And Constable Macbeth," Blair continued. "He can write up the reports. Simple police work, nothing more. Hardly worth mentioning in the official statement." "As you say, sir." Blair swept out to prepare his moment of glory, leaving Hamish and Jimmy alone in the corridor. "You just handed him the case on a silver platter," Jimmy said. "Aye, and in doing so I've demonstrated once again that I'm far too lazy and incompetent for promotion. Which means I get to stay in Lockdoob, where I belong." "You're a devious bastard, Hamish Macbeth." "I'm a practical one. Blair gets his headlines, Archie gets released, justice is served, and I avoid being transferred to some miserable urban posting. Everyone wins. Except Mary Sutherland." Hamish was quiet for a moment. "I except her." The trial came and went with surprising speed. Mary pled guilty to murder, sparing everyone the ordeal of a lengthy proceeding. Her confession was entered into evidence, along with the forensics, the diary and testimony from half of Lockdoob about her meticulous planning. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment with a recommendation for parole after 20 years. In his remarks, he noted the extraordinary circumstances and the provocation, but ultimately concluded that premeditated murder could not be excused, regardless of the victim's character. Mary accepted the verdict without emotion and was led away to begin her sentence. The village of Lockdoob struggled to reconcile the woman they had known with the killer she had become. The Curry sisters spent weeks analysing every interaction they'd ever had with her, searching for signs they had missed. Dr. Brodie looked haunted, knowing he had been targeted for destruction. Even the Reverend Wellington seemed shaken by the revelation that evil could wear such a gentle face. Only Angus MacDonald seemed unsurprised. "The spirits told me," he said sagely. "Dark secrets coming home to roost. I said it from the beginning." Hamish refrained from pointing out that Angus's spirits had been considerably less specific at the time. Archie MacLean returned to his cottage and his overbearing wife with visible relief, declaring that a week in a Strathbane cell had given him new appreciation for domestic tyranny. Mrs. MacLean greeted him with a hot meal and a long lecture about staying out of trouble in that order. Life in Lockdoob gradually returned to its normal rhythm. 3 weeks after the trial, Hamish received a letter from headquarters in Inverness. He opened it with trepidation, fearing it contained a promotion offer he would have to refuse. Instead, it was a formal commendation for his assistance in the Vane murder case, along with a note from the Chief Constable praising his dedication to community policing and his valuable support of the investigative team from Strathbane. Valuable support, not leadership, not brilliance, not exceptional detective work, or support. Hamish smiled and filed the letter away. His reputation as a lazy, barely competent constable remained intact. That evening, he sat on his doorstep watching the sun set over the loch, lugs at his feet and sonsy draped across his shoulders like a furry scarf. The purple hills stretched away to the horizon, ancient and unchanging, indifferent to human dramas of revenge and justice. Somewhere in those hills, Alistair Vane had met his end, and somewhere in a prison cell Mary Sutherland was beginning a life sentence for exacting the price of her father's ruin. Hamish felt no satisfaction in her capture, only a weary sadness for the waste of it all. 2 lives destroyed by old grievances, while the village that had embraced her as one of their own now struggled to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived. But that was the nature of the Highlands, he reflected. Beautiful and brutal, capable of inspiring both fierce loyalty and terrible vengeance. The land remembered everything, and sometimes people did too. He broke off a piece of shortbread from the tin beside him and offered half to Lugs, who accepted it with solemn gratitude. Sonsi yawned, displaying impressive fangs, and settled more comfortably around his neck. Inside the cottage his dinner was waiting, a simple meal of smoked fish and potatoes, nothing fancy. His sheep were fed, his paperwork was filed, and the village was at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new small dramas to navigate. Someone's sheep would go missing, or the Curry sisters would report suspicious activity that turned out to be the postman doing his rounds. Thun or Archie would need rescuing from some domestic crisis. But tonight, Hamish Macbeth was content. He had solved his murder, protected his village, and successfully avoided promotion. In the grand scheme of things, he thought, that was as close to victory as a lazy Highland constable could hope for. The mist rolled in across the loch, soft and familiar, wrapping Loch Dubh in its gentle embrace. Somewhere in the distance a sheep bleated. Closer by, Lug snored contentedly. Hamish smiled and went inside to his dinner, closing the door on another day in the life he had built, the life he had protected, the life he would continue to defend with quiet determination and carefully cultivated incompetence. The Highlands had their justice, Loch Dubh had its peace, and Hamish Macbeth had exactly what he wanted, his cottage, his animals, and his beloved village safe for another day.